Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's Repower webinar. We'll wait for a little while to so everyone can join in. It's not quite yet the allocated starting time for this webinar, but I just thought I'll let you know that you're in the right place, um, and I'll take advantage of these time to just make a couple of housekeeping announcements. So one of them is that this webinar is being recorded. So you will get a recording, a video recording, and also the slides that will be shown here today in an email. So that's something that you will get over the course of the next few days, probably early next week. Then I would also like to encourage you to say hello using the chat function. So if you look at the toolbar at the bottom, you'll see a few things, and one of them says chat. So use that to let us know where you're connecting from, and who you are. And then we can get a little bit of networking going, even though, it's not quite the same as when people are, live in the flesh in the same room, right? But yeah, I think it's a good thing to do. So yeah, do tell us who you are through the chat function. And the other thing I'd like to say is that we have you can send questions, right? So firstly, today we'll have Olamide talk about today's topic, which is how Africa can keep on um, the pace of electrification and giving energy access to people, even though aid has been cut back significantly. Um, so Olamide Niyi Afuye, who is the CEO of Lambda, will let us know about this, and give us his perspectives. And then you can actually ask questions using the Q&A function. So that will be, after his presentation, we'll be taking questions. So that's all really. So I don't know, Olamide, if you can turn on your camera and just say hello to the audience.
Thanks, Carlos. Good day, everyone. I'm pleased to be here. Looking forward to an engaging session.
Welcome, Olamide. So just as an introduction, right? I think that there's no secret that uh, aid from many Western countries has been cut back, and the US is probably the most prominent. But then you have, of course, the UK, Germany, France, pretty much all countries I could think of have at least Western countries have cut back on foreign aid, not just for electricity access, but for other things as well. And This could be a challenge, but also an opportunity, right? There has been a school of thought that has long thought that foreign aid is not the way uh, to help countries, developing countries, get to improve the standing, right? Um, so yeah, over to you. That's like in the way of like a mini introduction. So uh, I'll leave the floor to you now, Olamide. And thank you for being here today.
Thanks so much. Again, my name is Olamide Niyi Afuye, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer at the Africa Mini Grid Developers Association, AMDA for short. We are an industry association that supports mini grid companies towards their pathway to scale and financial sustainability. So this topic is very much right up our street. And in the face of I guess, the changing tide in the broad global geopolitical landscape, it's becoming very clear that we have to innovate or die, and we have to adapt to the pulse of what's happening and figure out more sustainable models for the deployment of mini grids at scale. So I will attempt to answer a few questions that were posed, starting with what governments are doing to address this concern. So Christina, do you mind moving to the next slide? So let me start with introducing AMDA a bit more. We were set up in 2018, and we currently have about 61 companies operating in 24 countries across 5 regions, with our broad focus on 4 main pillars: member value services, access to capital, policy, regulatory, regional coordination, research, data, and standards. And so we see ourselves as a full service support center for mini grid companies that are building in rural, peri-urban, and even urban parts of the continent. Next slide, please. So the first question is, how are governments across Africa shaping the journey towards universal energy access on their own terms? And I'm sure many of you have heard of the initiative called the Mission 300 initiative. Next slide, please, Christina. So just by way of broad introduction, Mission 300 is a bold initiative by the World Bank, AFDB, Rockefeller Foundation, and so many other partners to address a growing concern of powering Africa sustainably. And the aim of that mission is to achieve connect 300 million Africans to power by 2030. So not quite universal access, but its significant chunk will be addressed by this initiative. And one of the major pillars of that, or focus areas of that initiative, is that national governments will take full charge, full ownership of their electrification agenda through starting with delivering compacts. Compacts are essentially a strong mission statement for how companies wish to address these the broad reforms, the investment needs, and the overall sort of targets for their electrification agenda by 2030. As we speak today, we have over 20 or about 29 countries that have published their compacts and that are ready and willing to implement the necessary reforms and attract the necessary investments to achieve their electrification targets. From where we stand, this is one, if not the first time we've seen a very consolidated collaborative effort amongst the development partners and governments to see how we can strategically address the goals of the various countries. So each country is taking full ownership and implementing it through what they're calling the compact delivery and monitoring units. Each of these countries are setting these multi-stakeholder platforms where they would, first of all, drive down or fully articulate their targets and start to implement the relevant reforms. So from AMDA's perspective,
I think we are having some technical issues, so let's wait until Olamide is back online. I think you're back online now, Olamide, please. Go ahead.
give me. What was the last thing you heard? Apologies for that.
I quite tell actually, to be honest with you, but it was about 5 seconds that you were offline saying.
Okay, so I'll just say from a practical perspective, one of the key areas we're seeing areas for reform. Tariff is a big challenge in terms of sustainability, and so one of the tools that are being used by many of these many of these countries is the Africa Forum for Utility Regulators tariff tool, which is a means by which regulators can harmonize the tariff regime in their respective countries and also address some of the key questions that come up with respect to distributed renewable energy, such as what happens if the grid arrives. So that tool will help calculate based on whatever inputs that are put into the tool, and will determine, one, what is the optimal tariff, the cost-effective tariff for that mini grid project, and where the grid arrives, what is the calculation mechanism to determine the compensation for the mini grid. So in terms of how to attract investment, first of all, how to secure revenue, it addresses that, and also how to ensure that the asset is protected, that addresses that. Other policy reforms that we're seeing in the case of Zambia that has reduced significantly the time for approval of solar projects from what used to be 6 months to 48 hours. And so these taking leadership in terms of driving this change is now happening in a more strategic manner. And then from the investor perspective or investment perspective, with the announcement of Mission 300, we're seeing the emergence of various funds, like the Zafiri Fund and the Africa 50 DRE Fund, that will help to attract long-term affordable patient capital in the form of equity to the sector. And so where we stand with, if the governments put their money, or when the governments put their money where their mouth is and implement their compacts in the way that they've said, we will see that you'll probably see the emergence of more commercial capital into the sector. Not saying that there's no need for the subsidy programs, but as we've seen a reduction in aid, we would hopefully start to see attract more commercial capital to the sector. Where from AMDA's perspective, where we are willing and ready to work closely with the various stakeholders through our programmatic work. We have a platform called the AMDA Capital Connect that seeks to match investors with developers that have investment-ready projects. And so we'll continue to do more of these to attract sustainable, long-term, affordable, patient commercial capital into the sector. Next slide, please. Second question is, what role does renewable energy and decentralized energy models play in driving electrification and economic transformation? So next slide. So I'll borrow from what one of the ministers here in Nigeria said, which is there was a time when solar and DRE used to be niche, not anymore. We're seeing the emergence of distributed renewable energy solutions and mini grids as a mainstream component of the bigger electrification programs in Africa. I mentioned Mission 300. One of the key pillars is DRE and through mini grids. So in terms of whether they are temporary solutions, actually the question is no. So the emergence of solutions like interconnected mini grids, where the DRE solution is integrated into the conventional grid, and there's a commercial arrangement with the traditional grid utility. So we're seeing the emergence of that in countries like Nigeria, in countries like DRC, where one of AMDA members, PowerGen, for example, has set up a hybrid arrangement in a community called Toto in the north central area of Nigeria. And we're seeing the emergence of multiple interconnected mini grids that will complement the work of the grid and help reduce significantly losses. And so in terms of a practical example of how DRE plays a role, that is one. And you can't talk about electrification without talking about productive uses of energy. And where from where we stand, and some of our members are taking advantage of PUE solutions through cold storage facilities, through powering rice value chains in different countries. So I've given a few examples like Hydrobox in Kenya, in Madagascar. Anka is basically we were in Madagascar a few weeks ago, and we saw how through the work of one of Anka, we see that it's attracting tourist activity in the country, and hotels are now springing up. More businesses are springing up because of the way power, more sustainable power has gone to those areas. Those were completely off grid, and now Anka has basically become the primary utility in the areas that they serve. Also in Nigeria here, we're seeing the emergence of productive uses for agriculture, to name a few. Next slide, please. One area that I'm personally quite passionate about is how do we get allied industries incorporated in our electrification planning. And what do I mean by this? From where we stand, my vision is for every single agriculture project, telecoms project, e-mobility project, we should have an energy partner through, obviously more selfishly, mini grids, but fundamentally you cannot do power sustainably without having some level of anchor consumption. And so our partnerships with allied industries, where we identify where their projects are, and we basically take the power to where it's needed the most. You will find that most of these anchor consumption is actually done in rural peri-urban areas themselves. And so rather than planning electrification in silos, there's a need to make sure that there's a handshake between the other industries that would become the anchor consumers of the power, and that way you can build a sustainable revenue model for the mini grid, and also not lose the last mile connectivity that it seeks to address. From a very practical step, AMDA is actually deliberately recruiting somebody to unlock that demand partnerships and partnerships with allied industries to make sure that we are able to connect our members to the anchor businesses. I'll talk a little bit more about the ABC model in my future slide. Next slide, please. And I think the last but not the least question is, can commercially sustainable approaches accelerate access while reducing dependence on aid and subsidies? The simple answer to that question is absolutely. And I'd given a bit of a teaser as to what the ABC model represents. We're seeing the emergence of this model because it's becoming clear that as subsidy programs are starting to be phased out potentially, we need to find ways of, this is what I call innovate or die, where you find your anchor customer, a typically large and credit-worthy consumer that commits to purchasing a substantial amount of power from day one. I would actually say from day zero, because what that represents is the revenue assurance for the mini grid company, which means that justifies the basis for building the infrastructure in the first place. Then you have a cluster of small businesses that would also consume some of the power. So that's where your productive uses of energy comes in. And then a big chunk of, or a substantial chunk would also go to the communities. Now, what that does, or what that seeks to do is, one, addresses revenue assurance for the company. It also has a direct implication on the tariff that you would charge the community. And so these are the types of innovative models that we're seeing that are changing the narrative about reliance on grants solely in building mini grids. Another model that we're seeing is the hybrid commercial and industrial model with mini grids. One of our members, PowerGen, I've given them as an example in the past. They've raised significant funding to at a portfolio level. So they have different pipelines, some direct commercial and industrial. So those are typically backed by very clear power purchase agreements, PPAs. And then a portion of the funding would also go to your traditional utility mini grid model. And so with this sort of innovative fundraising exercise, we're seeing that companies are able to raise because they're not just relying solely on one type of business model. And then the last but not the least is the joint venture model, where we're seeing a very clear integration of DRE solutions, your typical mini grids, and your solar home or business systems, your standalone off-grid solar systems. One of our members based in Madagascar, Anka, recently signed an agreement with a company called Moon, an SHS provider, to co-fund and co-deploy, where the solar home systems are used for quick deployments and your initial revenue, and then the mini grids comes after a while, knowing fully well that one, the time to market for raising funding for infrastructure could take, at best 18 months. So rather than leave the communities that the mini grid seeks to power in the dark, they have an arrangement with a solar home system to provide the initial power, and then use that time to build trust, build loyalty, understand the community's needs a bit more, and raise money to build the longer term solution like the mini grids. Next slide. And in terms of revenues, it goes without saying that mini grids, especially renewable energy mini grids, are solving a climate need, and so they should get the benefit of any sort of compensation that for the work that they're doing. And so the emergence of renewable energy certificates is another pool of extra income for the mini grids to monetize the environmental attributes that they are providing for generating clean power. And we're also seeing some of our members also taking advantage of that to monetize the work that they're doing and get a bit of extra income. So with this, we see various innovative solutions to addressing some of the pain points in terms of the growing sort of geopolitical evolution from aid to sustainability. Fundamentally speaking, I think it's very clear that there's no free lunch anymore, and we have to think a bit more innovatively. We have to think a bit more commercially, and our members, our community, are responding to that. From AMDA's perspective, I spoke a little bit about our Capital Connect and our finance series that seeks to equip mini grid developers with more financial knowledge and the tools to develop and secure funding for their projects. So with that, I think I will stop there and take maybe any questions or comments from the audience. Thank you for listening. And
Thank you very much, Olamide. So that's very interesting, what you have shown about how the private sector can step in, and help well, quicken the pace of electrification and energy access. Um, so since you represent the mini grids industry, I'm sure that you hear all the time, formally and informally, in reports and in conversations about some of the common challenges that mini grid operators have. So based on that, do you have um, an idea of one of the main barriers that governments maybe could seek to remove or to mitigate to help electrification?
yeah, thanks for that question. I think if the government wants to invite private sector, uh, we need to create an enabling environment, and that phrase is used almost abused these days. But what does that mean from the perspective? So, quick turnaround time for licensing, a clear tariff regime where there's some level of certainty that the private sector will get a cost-reflective tariff, where in the growing face of reduction in subsidies, or the government itself could provide some incentive, for example, tax breaks. In some African countries, we have the concept of pioneer status. What does that mean? Pioneer status is you're coming to build novel, or innovative infrastructure in a country, and so you get the benefit of pioneer status, which means that you get a tax break for a number of years. In some countries, I believe you have a tax break of 3 years with the option of an additional two. So maybe a maximum of 5 years where you're not paying taxes. Those are various ways to incentivize private sector. And also, I mean, clarity of the regulatory regime, clarity of the policy, consistency in the implementation of policy. Those are some of the practical things that governments can do to incentivize private sector investment.
Okay, great. That makes complete sense, you know. So and you mentioned in your ABC model the concept of an anchor industry. Then you have you know, SMEs, and then you have private households. So um, what's the role in that model, or you know, in your view, or the initiatives you're seeing of productive uses of energy? So um, in other contexts, I've seen that there is a lot of emphasis on enabling activities are already taking part in villages, and particularly in the rural context, and essentially almost encouraging people and training them to switch to more productive machinery that works with electricity. It also, because they rely on diesel, it tends to be more more cost effective, right? So it's still, you know, like a significant outlay in that context, but it tends to be more cost efficient than diesel. I think people forget, you know, that what you pay for diesel in a remote location is not what you pay in cities. You pay quite a bit more.
That's true.
Um, so yeah, so what are your thoughts on productive uses of energy, you know, and is that a way to actually help I don't know, strengthen the business case of mini grids and microgrids?
Yes. So productive use of energy plays a big role. And where we stand, what I said, this sort of anchor business model, the B in in that also addresses the PUE concern, but
Mhm.
more fundamentally, if we go further down to the households, yes, more efficient appliances, more income generating I guess uses of the power. So basically
Yeah.
daytime consumption plays a big role. So that is one of many ways. So the ABC model is a big umbrella for addressing that concern. But it starts with having a solid anchor that would
Mhm.
that would consume a huge chunk of the power to guarantee the sustainability of that infrastructure. What we find is that where you have a PPA or a quasi PPA arrangement with a consumer, with a major consumer,
Mhm.
it means that basically that infrastructure is going to last for the period of that contract at the bare minimum. And
Yeah.
from where I see PUE, I see PUE from a broader rural economic development perspective. You know, so how do we make sure that there is use of the power that also gives some level of income back to the community or job
Mhm.
creation? So I hope I've answered your
Okay.
question.
Yeah, no, it does. It does. So there is one question here in the Q&A box, and it's um, by Melina Gito, and excuse my pronunciation, but of your name. But yeah, it says, "What is the definition of universal energy access in the context of your presentation?" So, yeah.
Well, universal access would be that everybody has power. In the context of my presentation, um, I would refer back to the compacts. So the idea of the National Energy Compact is that every country will make its own declaration of what it seeks to achieve by the end of 2030 now in this scenario. Some are ambitious and saying, or ambitious enough to say we want to power every single citizen, and some are also maybe more maybe depending on their circumstances, would say we're going to power 80% of our population by 2030. So universal access is that everybody has power, but at the national level, every country would have to set their own priorities, some of whom would seek to achieve universal access. Some may not by the timeline that they set, so 2030. I mean more optimistically, I expect that every single country seeks to achieve universal access. It's just a matter of when.
Mm.
Thank you.
No, thank you. And 2030 is around the corner, it's not I've been hearing about 2030 since I don't know, since the early 2000s, as an objective, but now it's really 4 years away. So it's a big challenge. So
That is true.
um there is another question here is by Gabriel Boating Appia, and he's asking, um, in the event that the government cannot fund the mini grid energy program, is it possible for the private sector to go ahead and single-handedly set up the power system, e.g., solar power system, and impose their own tariffs, whether it's affordable or not? Wouldn't this affect local industry and job creation as a result? So I think that's one of these questions that it really depends on. Well,
Yeah.
you could clearly say it depends, right, on where, what the context is. But over to you, Alameda, that you are the expert. So.
Yeah. Thanks. That's a good question. I think it would be typically you don't see many private sector players, investors go into a market where there's not enough clarity in the policy. So it stems from clear policy regime. I did speak about the tariff tool. So if we use the example of the AFUR tariff tool, what the Foreign Free Utility Regulator seeks to do is that they engage the regulator to adapt it or to adopt the templates. And so that template would be used to determine tariff. And where the tariff has been approved, that would be the basis for whatever commercial arrangements are. Now, in the CNI space, in the commercial and industrial space, that's slightly different because it's a willing buyer, willing seller. So I agree the terms of the contract with my off-taker. Once they're fine with it, I think in some regimes, there's still a need for an approval, provided that it doesn't it's within their framework. But I think that very rarely would you see in the past private sector independently go and go without some level of government approval. I'm sure that in most regimes there's some level of oversight from the government. If the tariff is not to address that, with that in mind, it's very rare that you'd see a tariff that is approved that would be so distortive to the local industry. In fact, you will find that most tariffs are additive. And then going back to the anchor business community model that I explained, if you have an anchor business that consumes a good chunk of your power, you've agreed or a tariff, what that does automatically, one is that it guarantees some level of revenue assurance for the company, for the mini grid company. It boosts local industry because what you would find is that most of the people in that area will be the ones hired. So there's some level of job creation. And it also means that the residual power that goes to the community, in addition to the fact that jobs are created so they can earn revenue to pay their bills, it means that it could potentially reduce the tariff that will be charged to the residential customers. I hope I've answered your question, Gabriel. Thanks for that.
Okay. Thank you, Olamide. So I think there is another question that talks about tariff setting, right? So the question says, so you go for adequate connection rate to citizens based on a country context. So if I understand that correctly, I think this person is asking whether you need to set the tariff in accordance to the going rate in the country. I know this is a whole like massive discussion, right? So, but what have you seen? You know, how do tariffs get set? Roughly speaking, by the way, we'll have another webinar in the future when we'll have AFA, and
Yeah,
they'll present the like tariff setting tool. So
yeah.
there'll be like a lot more detail there. But you know, maybe you can give us an idea here.
Thanks. I understood the question differently. I will answer that question, but I
Okay.
understood it. I understood it as the percentage, like each country sets their own percentage
Oh,
targets, and simple answer to that question, Belena, is yes. But to answer the tariff question, I think what typically happens is that a company seeks to build a mini grid in an identified community. So they would have done their feasibility studies to map out what their types of business, their basically done their customer enumeration. So determine the profile of customers, their ability to pay, and what needs to go into supplying them sustainable power. Yeah, so I think Belena has given additional context, so I think I understood his or her question.
yeah. So your
Properly.
interpretation was right, mine was not. So yeah.
Yeah, yeah, but to answer your question, so once that is done, that would naturally inform the level of capital expenditure that goes into it, and so using the full tool, there would be a few inputs that you would put into, based on your CapEx, your OpEx, and that will, it would generate what your optimal tariff would be. And then you go to the regulator, provided that they've adopted that tool. You go to the regulator and seek to approve apply for an approval of the tariff. Regulator approves your tariff, and you're good to go.
Okay. Makes sense. So you've answered both questions now. So uh, Delaney, I hope that we have you got an answer to the question that you made. So um, looking at we're talking about electrification, right? In the context of um an industry that particularly when the repower in the repower context, well, for those that don't know, repower is an EU-funded project that seeks to provide access to electricity to 27,000 people by 2027. So the and these the through renewable energy and to renewable mini grids. These mini grids are in rural areas, right? So almost by definition, you are trying to provide electricity to in places where um, the ability to pay for electricity is limited. Um, so how do you do that? So you start quite small and then you can expand. But I think there is a lot of hope, in Africa electrifying, because if you look at every single country that ever built a grid, it really started with well with almost like mini grids, and then they were interconnected with each other. It always worked that way. There was no big plan, in the US or in England to like build a massive grid to start with and connect it with each other. And you know what the good thing is that in lack of infrastructure is a challenge, but also means that you don't have all of uh, the obstacles that exist in infrastructure imposes on you in many cases. So that means that you can really do a plan that is designed for your very context. And now I think with mini grids and with microgrids. There are lots of places, and not just in Africa, but also, for example, in the United States, in Texas, there are microgrids that are connected with the main grid for energy resilience. Now, Olamide, you mentioned that that's one of the things that you are seeing in Africa as well, right? So, traditionally, what I thought is that you got when you saw, or yeah, it's actually when the traditional thought is that when the main grid arrives, then there is no business case for the mini grid. But you're saying because the rate tends to be lower, but you're saying now that those mini grids are signing agreements with the main utilities, and then they become part of the infrastructure. So how does that work? And could you tell us a little bit more about that? You're on mute, by the way.
Yeah, thanks, Carlos. So I'll take a couple of steps back and explain why I think we're seeing the emergence of DRE as a long-term solution here. You're right
Mhm.
that it typically starts small and then grows, and many countries in more developed country in the more developed context have built extensive grids that go as far and that are far-reaching. But it unfortunately in some countries in Africa, we found that one, the grid has not been built as wide as extensively as perhaps would be the case in other countries. And two, the even the existing grid is not strong enough and or resilient enough to withstand any sort of additional uh, injection. So currently,
Mm.
I'm not an engineer, so I'll just allow me to express it in more layman's terms. Because there's still a need for power, you're seeing the emergence of decentralized solution. I always say that in my country, Nigeria, we've been self-generating for years. So we've had the concept of DRE without giving it a name has existed
Yeah.
for years because people um almost always have additional sources of power to the grid. And then you've seen parts of some countries where there is life beyond the grid, but no lights at all. There's no grid whatsoever. So you've seen the emergence of these solutions. And so with a more now structured approach to building these infrastructure, with the emergence of more developers that are willing to take the hunch and become utilities in their own rights, you're starting to see that DRE is taking its place. And so we were just in DRC on a country mission, and one of the things that the regulator said was, you know, whilst it's good to have a framework for what happens where the grid arrives, it could be the case in some instances that the grid never arrives, and so
Yeah.
yeah, and so the DRE solution, the mini grid, will become the grid in that area.
Yeah.
Now, with the emergence of interconnected mini grids, what you're seeing is that there are some peri-urban sort of they're grid tied communities that are not getting a lot of supply. And so the lowest hanging fruit is to get a distributed generator to plug into the existing grid network, possibly reinforce the network to make sure that there's more reliability. One, that what that does is that reduces the losses from the traditional utility, and it also increases reliability in the network that they're doing that they've built, the existing network. So there's a commercial arrangement where the mini grid utility would use the system. Well, in some countries, it's called the distributed use of system, uh, where they would also be in charge of revenue collection. So they would probably meter. As you know, many of the traditional grid utilities in Africa are not doing so well financially. So interconnected mini grids are seen as a solution to helping them reduce their losses, increase their revenue, and also improve their quality of supply. Thank you.
Right. Thank you. So that makes so much sense. And now, I suppose before actually you didn't have that option because um, you couldn't, quite well set up a distributed coal plant. You need scale for that. But with solar and batteries, and other renewables, you could do that. So um, then interesting question by Gabriel Boten Appian. He's asking, um, as an expert or consultant, would you advise a government that does not produce oil to opt for a thermal energy grid for its industry? So I don't know. You want to go into that?
That's an interesting question. I mean, first of all, I would be a bit selfish and say that I would advise them to open up to private sector to by basically I think somebody always says government is not in the business of doing business. They're in the business of enabling business to thrive. And so I would I understand that every country has its own different contexts, and some countries like Nigeria, where we're seeing the emergence of scaled DRE solutions and other distributed renewable energy solutions. That is proving to be a very useful solution where you invite private sector. They think a bit from a more commercial perspective. They find innovative ways to guarantee their revenues. So that's where I would encourage government to go. I also understand that in some countries, like Ghana, for example, the government is very much holding their electrification agenda quite closely. And they've done quite well, I must say. Um, but but I would still encourage that maybe free up the government balance sheet, open up for private sector to use DRE solutions to power your industry. What you will find is that most industrial customers are now looking at cleaner sources of electrification. And so for me, that's the way to go.
So, I mean, I haven't looked at the numbers, but I am sure that there is a lot of capital in Africa that you could, in different countries, maybe more so in other countries than others. And um, I don't know, just, thinking out loud here. So is there any way to actually encourage that capital to flow, that private capital to flow to the areas where it's most needed? I think I've seen, for example, a couple of startups that do electric mobility, and I think, well, like looking at um, Madagascar is probably I think is the last African country I visited like a year or two ago, and I've noticed a couple of things. One of them is that petrol and diesel were just as expensive as anywhere, and also that the streets were full of cars. If they did manage to electrify transport, I could imagine this could become an opportunity to build infrastructure. And I thought, well, and Ethiopia, I haven't been in Ethiopia for like a few years, for like 5 years or so, but I know that they're really going for electrification of transport. Are there any like business models like that you think like, well, they make sense because they tap into an existing need? You're not trying to create a market, and they could create a large pool of demand. It could be profitable in its own terms and could attract capital, that, well, from Nigeria, South Africa, and, the places in Africa where traditionally there is capital, right? So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think you've just added a fresh context to the point that we made about allied industries. Um, for us, uh, typically, commercial money, commercial capital typically goes where there's level of revenue assurance or some level of certainty that I put my money in and I'm going to get X% return. And so the business model and why you're seeing huge advancement of the Anchor business community model is that seeks to address that huge sort of question of this financial sustainability. And so, yes, to answer your question very simply, this goes to broader electrification planning. So where countries are setting their priorities, I think we should be able to quickly tell where the various industrial blocks or would be, and so that when we are planning the electrification, we're taking power to where it's needed the most.
Brilliant. So that makes a lot of sense. So well, I see that there are no questions from the audience. So um, maybe I think it be time to bring this conversation to a close, this webinar. So um, any parting words to the audience before we leave?
Yeah, I would say, first of all, thank you for this platform. It was a great sort of way to juggle my memory of a lot of things from my past. I thank you to the audience for listening and for those who asked questions. I hope we did justice to them. And last but not least, I thank my team for all the hard work to make this happen. This would not be without you. So Eric, Mirna, well done. Looking forward to the next one.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Olamide. And well, I encourage you to actually check out AMDA's website if you want to know about mini grids. They're actually one of my favorite sources. So you can go, I suppose it is amda.com, right? Um, or
AfricaMDA.org.
africamda.org. So not what I say at all. So I'm just going to share it in the chat so you have it. And also, I'm fairly sure that you probably already know, but there you go, you have shared it. Um, uh, so you probably already know, but do have a look at the Repower Project's website, and there will be posting information on rural electrification, mini grids, uh, webinars such as this one. So, so yeah, be good to actually, um, you know, see you join the newsletter that we send weekly, and do and see you at other webinars too. So, Olamide, thank you very much. Thank you to everyone who connected today, and take care. Have a good day. Bye bye.